You're listening to Seattle Real Estate Podcast.
Today, right here on the Seattle Real Estate Podcast, we are going international. We're going to talk about an international topic. It's real estate. It actually is. We're reading from Vice World News. Berlin, city in Germany, backs a referendum to seize properties. They're going to take properties away from mega landlords and have the government control them. You will have nothing and you will like it. That's what comes to mind to me here. All right. So what are we doing? Up to 240,000 properties could be expropriated from landlords after voters overwhelmingly backed a non-binding referendum aimed at tackling the housing crisis in Germany's capital. It's a big story. It doesn't really mean anything. What we just read here doesn't really mean anything. But it just means there's a wee bit of pressure on politicians to do something about this. We'll see if they do. It's a crazy situation where you have landlords that own as many units as they do in Berlin. The numbers are pretty staggering. I'll read some here in a second. But before I do, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Sean Reynolds. I own a couple of real estate companies, and I read the news. Voters have overwhelmingly backed a radical proposal to take properties away from some of Berlin's biggest landlords and put them into public ownership. You will own nothing and you will love it. Just over 56% of people voted in favor of a referendum calling on authorities in the German capital to expropriate flats and apartments from all landlords who own more than 3,000 properties. In total, 1.7 million valid votes were counted, with about 1,034,000 in favor of the referendum's motion and 715,000 cast against. So it did win. I mean, it won pretty clearly, but this doesn't really mean anything. It just means you've got a bunch of tenants who are like, yeah, we want to stop paying high rents. Although the referendum is non-binding, it creates huge pressure on the state legislature in Berlin to act. Campaign group Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen, probably butchered that, which helped organize the referendum, said it could lead up to 240,000 apartments being bought off mega landlords, which represents around 15% of Berlin's total housing stock. All right, let's talk about this. So 15% of Berlin's housing stock now gets run by the government. How's that going to work out? What does that look like? I don't even want to know. 15%. That is going to rock those markets. I mean, and that's if this ever even happens, right? This is a non-binding referendum. But man, it's a good title, right? Because you're like, 240,000 units being basically taken from landlords. How do they decide that? Like, okay, you got over 3,000 units. You're going to have to sell everything between, 3,000 and 4,000 units. It's where this whole thing, I mean, how does that even work? What are the mechanics of this? How does this make sense? I don't know, but it's what they're doing in Berlin. I do want to visit Berlin just to go hang out there. And I've heard it's a really cool city and I'd like to go there. I think one of my kids has been there. My kids have done more traveling than I have. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm older, been more places, but those kids, they just get out there and go. Deutsche Wohnen and Enteignen hopes the socialization of the housing stock will provide lower rents. They hope. All right, we're going to take over 240,000 units, and this is what we hope happens. I'd want a little more than hope on a situation like this. And they hope to reduce the monopolization of the housing market in the city, which has seen rents rise around 30% since 2015. 30% in 6 years? That doesn't seem like that much to me. It doesn't. Now, have they had a long rise in rents, maybe 30% here in the last 6 years is substantial. Maybe they're higher to begin with. I don't know a lot about Germany's rental market. But let's keep going. Campaigners, many of whom have been working on the movement for years, were cheering and hugging at a result party as the early polls suggested a strong lead on Sunday night. It's a very emotional night, Leonard Hawes, a campaigner from the Kreutzburg local group, told Vice World News. It's just so effing amazing. I would have never believed the results would be so clear. The referendum was able to take place after Deutsche Wohnen took advantage of a mechanism in German law which allows certain topics to go to a referendum if a group can collect 175,000 signatures from city residents. In June, campaigners announced that they had collected 343,000 signatures in the housing referendum, which received a boost when a citywide rent cap was overturned in April. So that is some of what has been happening here is, rent cap, pull the lid on that. And so now you've got a situation, rents going up, and they've been going up clearly the last 6 years. Is this non-binding referendum, is this going to do anything? The next stage for the campaign is likely to be the German High Court, where landlord organizations are expected to claim that the expropriation of properties would violate German constitutional law, something Deutsche Wohnen and whatever disputes. Together, we moved the city and shook up politics. That's what we're celebrating today, said Joanna Kusiak, a spokesperson for Deutsche Wohnen. Thousands have become active with us. We are anchored with our structures in each district. We faced powerful opponents inside and won. We're not going away anytime soon. The referendum took place against the backdrop of a dramatic federal election as Germans decided who would replace Angela Merkel as chancellor after 16 years in office. The center-left SDP has emerged as the largest party, overtaking Merkel's CDU and the CSU. The SDP's Olaf Scholz will now attempt to form a coalition government with the Greens and Liberals to become the next chancellor of Germany. Again, I know about as much about German politics as I do the German housing market. So regardless of its composition, the federal government coalition will have to implement the socialization of housing corporations, said Kusiak. The demand for socialization unites far more voices behind it than any party. We Berliners have decided nobody's allowed to speculate with our apartments. You will own nothing and you will be happy. That's what kind of keeps coming to mind here is, all right, you are monkeying with forces of the marketplace. Granted, Berlin's got an awful lot of power within a handful of landlords, a coalition of big landlords. It kind of sounds like, I did do a little research of this. There's some landlords that own a lot of units in Berlin. Thousands and thousands and thousands. You might say that about the United States as well, but not within basically a city. City here in Seattle, yeah, we've got landlords that own, multiple big projects, but not like 250,000 units. We just don't have that much housing here in Seattle. In other cities across the United States, same thing. You don't have that concentrated of a number of landlords owning that many units. So you've got some different dynamics going on here. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. Does the German government, they've got some change-ups going with their leadership, obviously with the elections. It'll be interesting to see, does this issue, get put to the test and actually some kind of laws enacted where they take, literally, all right, you've got way too many units. We deem that to be not a good thing. Never mind the whole constitutional deal over here. We're just going to forget about that at the moment because this seems to be more important. Kind of feels like that's what's happening, right? You've just got a huge group of tenants who have risen up and said, yeah, too much power in control in the hands of too few. And I get that, but this is also housing. So now you're going to take that housing and you're going to turn it over to the government. And whenever that happens, I don't care who it is, it doesn't end pretty. It doesn't work out. Look at anything run by any government in any scenario. Is it like really stellar? I mean, there's a few examples I can think of where governments have done some good things, but typically not with housing. And you're talking about the government taking over, 15% of the housing market. They've got a lot of rental units in Berlin. I mean, you just extrapolate that 15% out. That's a ton of rental units. So it appears like it's a different market than, say, in a United States market where you've got a lot of condo ownership. Berlin, you've got more apartments. That's what the majority of their rental housing is. And that's kind of what we're talking about. You've got some big projects with, huge number of units. And that's how you can get the concentration of ownership into, I don't know how many owners there are in Berlin, but when you're talking about 15%, taking over 15% of the housing stock, and it's hundreds of thousands of units, that's a massive rental market, right? So that's why you've probably got tenants that are worked up and they're like, we've got the rent controls overturned. Now we need to do something. This is what we want to see happen. And I get their motivation, but turning it over to the government, yeah. I'd like to say, hey, let's watch and see how that train wreck goes. But like any train wreck, at the end, it doesn't go well. It doesn't turn out well for those on the train. You know what I mean? So some of these things that are coming up, you're kind of like, that's a head scratcher, but it's not in the United States. So why don't we follow along and just see how that goes? I mean, it couldn't be that bad, could it? I just did a podcast on Seattle City Council. You just got to say those 3 words and you get a giggle afterwards, right? It's like, what are they going to do next? Well, right now, they've basically stated that landlords need to give 180 days notice of a rent increase. It's gone from 62 months to 6 months notice of a rent increase. Hey, I know you're only halfway in on your lease, your year-long lease, but the government is dictating that if I do want to give you a rent increase, here's what it's going to be. I mean, just crazy stuff like that. And if we increase your rent more than XYZ, I'm going to have to help you out with, you moving, with your relocation costs, doing some crazy things with the rental market. So when you take 15% of a city's rental housing stock, give it to the government, and government does who knows what as far as management goes to said rental housing stock, I could see that being rather unstable. We're doing what? Why? Oh, yeah, that whole referendum thing. Oh, I don't know. I understand why the tenants would be really for this, but again, it's kind of like in the city of Seattle where you've got the city council trying to protect their tenants so desperately that unfortunately the end result is something that impacts the tenants very negatively, and that's in the form of higher rents. So what would the government in Germany, in Berlin, be able to do better than the private landlords? I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to thoughts. I'm open to rethinking and reimagining how that might turn out. But any which way you look at it, it just doesn't strike me as, that's a really solid idea. I think you should run with that because I just kind of want to see how it ends up. Can you imagine maintenance on these, government-owned units? It's never a good look, is it? Here in Seattle, we've got, oftentimes you'll hear of Section 8, and that's basically government-sponsored housing. They'll cover up to XYZ percentage of the rent on a unit. Those are always privately owned. And those units are hammered on because tenants in Section 8, the government's basically They are committing to cover whatever percentage of the tenant, because they're low income, cover whatever percentage of that tenant's unit rent. It might be 90% of the rent the government's chipping in, but the tenants rarely take care of the property. And that's on a privately held unit. Now you've got the government taking care of it. In government, in all of its efficiency, how do you think that's going to go? I don't know. I don't even think I want to see that. But, we might. We could. We'll just have to follow this one along. All right. That's it for me on this one. We went international. Berlin, Germany. I do want to visit there. Sounds like a cool city. Need to get there before the government housing stock of 15% is taken over. Nah, I don't think anything really comes out of this. I think this is more of a headline. Maybe something will come of it from down the road, but the mechanics of 250,000 units switching hands, basically, government takeover. I don't see that happening. But then again, we've got this non-binding referendum. So, be reasonable, be thinking, okay, maybe something will happen. We'll just have to wait and see how that goes. But to me, this is more of a headline, and it's a concept that is out there, and it falls more in line to what I've been referencing to you will own nothing and you will love it. That whole concept, which to me, that part is frightening. Yep. Government takeover of, private housing. Yeah. Okay. Well, need to keep an eye on that. That's the bottom line from this podcast. Okay. Thanks again for joining. Thanks so much for supporting Seattle Real Estate Podcast. I will catch up with you soon. Until then, stay safe, make good choices, and we'll talk again. Bye. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when our next video is out.